Have you ever been somewhere so remote that you felt like the last person on Earth? My name is Sienna Walsh. I'm a cultural heritage officer with Parks Canada. For the past 6 years, I've worked at remote historical sites across British Columbia. My job is to protect and document Indigenous artifacts, colonial structures, and archaeological sites that the public never sees. I catalog relics. I monitor deterioration. I file reports about weather damage and vandalism. Most people think it's boring work, solitary work, and they're right. But that's exactly why I took the job. If you stay until the end, I'll tell you about the rules. The ones they gave me on my first day but didn't explain until it was almost too late. The ones about the totems, about the fog, about what happens when you're watching something that shouldn't be able to move. Because on Kitimat Island, there are protocols that have nothing to do with heritage preservation. Protocols that were written long before Parks Canada existed. Protocols that keep you alive. I grew up in Victoria. My mother was a librarian. My father taught anthropology at UVic. I spent my childhood in museums and archives, learning to handle fragile documents with white gloves, understanding the difference between preservation and restoration, respecting objects that were older than my country. After university, I got my certification in cultural resource management. I wanted work that mattered. Work that didn't involve office politics or open concept workspaces. Work where I could be alone with history. Parks Canada hired me right out of graduate school. My first posting was a fur trading post in the Yukon, then a lighthouse on Haida Gwaii, then a missionary church in the interior. Each assignment lasted 6 to 18 months. Each location is more isolated than the last. I learned to handle loneliness. I learned to fill my days with meticulous documentation. I learned that I preferred the company of artifacts to people. After 5 years of rotating assignments, I requested a longer posting. Something stable. Something where I could really dig into the preservation work without constantly relocating. That's when they offered me Kitimat Island. 3-year assignment. Solo posting. Small research station with living quarters. Monthly supply drops. Satellite internet. The island had 18 documented totem poles from the Tsimshian people. Pre-contact era. Some of the oldest standing totems in British Columbia. My job would be to document their current condition, monitor weather damage, take measurements and photographs. Standard heritage preservation work. The posting came with higher pay, isolation allowance, and a 3-page list of protocols that seemed excessive for a simple documentation project. Rules about when I could and couldn't approach the totems, about what to do if I heard certain sounds, about staying inside the research station when the fog rolled in. I read through them once. They seemed like standard safety protocols mixed with cultural sensitivity guidelines. I signed the acknowledgement form without really thinking about it. That was my first mistake. The island is 43 kilometers off the northern coast of British Columbia. No permanent residents. No tourist access. It used to be a seasonal fishing camp for the Tsimshian people. They abandoned it sometime in the 1880s. Left behind the totems and nothing else. The Canadian government declared it a protected heritage site in 1973. Since then, Parks Canada has maintained a small research station on the southeastern shore, usually unstaffed, visited only for seasonal assessments. I arrived in late September. The weather was already turning cold. A helicopter dropped me and my supplies on a concrete pad near the research station. The pilot helped me unload. Then he handed me a radio and a laminated card. "Emergency frequencies are on the back," he said. "But don't expect rescue if the weather's bad. We can't fly in fog or high winds. You'll need to wait it out." I looked at the laminated card. On the front was a simplified map of the island. On the back, emergency protocols. And at the bottom, in small print, consult station protocols for fog procedures. Non-negotiable. What fog procedures? I asked. The pilot looked uncomfortable. There's a binder in the station. Read it tonight. Follow it exactly. Don't improvise. He climbed back into the helicopter, lifted off without another word, left me standing there with 6 months of supplies and a growing sense of unease. The research station was small but well maintained. One main room with a kitchenette and desk. One bedroom. One bathroom with a composting toilet and rainwater shower. Solar panels on the roof. Backup generator. Satellite dish. Everything I needed to live alone for months at a time. The walls were bare except for maps of the island and a bulletin board covered in yellowed notices about radio schedules and supply drop dates. On the desk was the binder the pilot had mentioned. Thick. Freering. Labeled Kitimat Island Station Protocols Mandatory Compliance. I made tea and sat down to read it. The first section was standard stuff. Radio check-in times. Emergency procedures. What to do if the solar panels failed or the water filtration broke. How to signal for evacuation if I got injured. Normal remote station protocols I'd seen at every posting. The second section was different. It was titled Cultural Site Access Protocols, and it was 23 pages long. The language was formal, bureaucratic, but as I read, my skin started to prickle. Protocol CS1. Never approach the totem sites during fog conditions. If fog develops while you are at a site, immediately return to the station by the most direct route. Do not run. Do not look back at the totems. Proceed at a normal walking pace. Protocol CS2. Document the totems only during clear daylight hours. Begin work no earlier than 2 hours after sunrise. Conclude work no later than 2 hours before sunset. Do not visit the sites at dawn, dusk, or night under any circumstances. Protocol CS3. If you hear drumming sounds coming from the forest, return to the station immediately. Lock all doors and windows. Do not investigate the source of the sounds. Wait until they stop before resuming outdoor activities. Protocol CS4. The totems must be photographed from designated observation points only. Do not approach closer than 10 meters. Do not touch the poles. Do not remove any organic material from the site for analysis. The list went on. 23 pages of restrictions that went far beyond standard archaeological protocols. Some of them made no sense. Why couldn't I approach during fog? Why the specific timing around sunrise and sunset? Why the obsession with sounds from the forest? At the bottom of the section was a note in different handwriting, pen instead of typed text. It said, "These protocols exist for your safety. Previous station officers who violated them experienced severe psychological distress. 2 required evacuation and medical intervention. Follow the protocols exactly. Do not attempt to rationalize or modify them. What you don't understand can still hurt you." I closed the binder and looked out the window. The sun was setting. The forest beyond the research station was dark and dense. Massive cedar and spruce trees that had never been logged. And somewhere out there, scattered across the island in 4 different locations, were the 18 totems I'd been sent to document. I had 3 years on this island, 3 years of solitary work among artifacts that were sacred to people whose descendants still lived on the mainland. 3 years of following protocols I didn't understand. 3 years of wondering why the pilot had looked so uncomfortable. Why that handwritten note mentioned psychological distress. Why previous officers had needed evacuation. But I'd signed the contract. Accepted the posting. There was no backing out now. Tomorrow I'd begin my documentation work. I'd visit the first totem site. I'd take measurements and photographs and notes. I'd follow the protocols exactly as written. And I'd try not to think about why those protocols existed in the first place. Because in the morning, I'd learned something that the binder hadn't mentioned. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about this assignment. Something that made those 23 pages of restrictions suddenly make terrible sense. I'd learn why the totems needed to be documented from a distance. Why fog conditions made them dangerous. Why previous officers had broken under the psychological strain. And why the Tsimshian people had abandoned this island over a century ago, leaving behind their sacred poles but taking everything else. But that discovery would wait until morning. For now I made dinner, unpacked my equipment, set up my sleeping bag in the small bedroom, and tried to ignore the feeling that something outside was watching the research station, waiting for me to make my first mistake. Waiting for me to violate a protocol, waiting for the fog to roll in. Because on Kitimat Island, the totems weren't just historical artifacts. They were something else. Something active. Something that the protocols were designed to manage but not explain. And tomorrow, when I saw them for the first time, I'd understand why this posting had such high pay. Why was it always assigned to solo officers? Why did no one stay for the full 3 years? Tomorrow I'll see the totems. And they'd see me. And nothing would ever feel quite safe again. The next morning it dawned clear and cold. I woke up at 6. Made coffee. Reviewed the protocols one more time. My first site visit would be to the northern cluster. For totems standing in a clearing about 2 kilometers from the station. According to my briefing documents, they were among the best preserved on the island. Eagle, raven, bear, thunderbird. Each one carved from massive cedar logs. Each one is over 3 meters tall. I packed my equipment carefully. Digital camera, measuring tape, notebook, tablet for entering data, water bottle, emergency radio, and the laminated protocol card the pilot had given me. I clipped it to my jacket even though I'd memorized the rules. Something about having it visible felt important. The trail to the northern site was well maintained. Someone had cleared it recently, cut back the undergrowth, marked it with reflective tape on the trees. I followed the path through dense forest. The morning was perfectly still. No wind. No birds, just the sound of my boots on packed earth and my breathing in the cold air. After 30 minutes, the forest opened into a clearing, and there they were. 4 totem poles standing in a rough square. Weathered gray wood, faded paint still visible in the carved details. Each pole is different but clearly part of a set. They faced outward away from each other, like guardians watching the 4 directions. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, checked my watch. 8:30 a.m. Well within the permitted hours. The weather is clear. No fog. I was following every protocol. So why did I feel like I was being watched? Protocol CS4 required me to photograph from designated observation points. I found the first marker, a wooden stake with a yellow tag. 10 meters from the nearest totem. I set up my camera, started taking documentation photos, wide shots, detail shots, close-ups of the weathering patterns and structural condition. The eagle totem was in good condition, some splitting in the wood, lichen growth on the north face, but overall stable. I made notes, moved to the next observation point, photographed the raven totem, then bear, then thunderbird. Standard documentation work. Nothing unusual, except for the positions. I'd reviewed archival photos before coming to the island. Historical documentation from the 1970s when the site was first surveyed. In those photos, the totems faced different directions. The eagle had faced north, raven east, Bear south, Thunderbird west, clear cardinal alignment. But now they were rotated. Maybe 15 degrees, maybe 20. Not much, but enough that it was noticeable when I compared my photos to the archive images on my tablet. The alignment was off, like someone had turned each pole slightly, but that was impossible. These totems weighed hundreds of kilograms. They were set deep in the ground, weathered into place over a century. They couldn't just rotate, could they? I checked my measurements 3 times, used the GPS to confirm exact positions. The poles had definitely moved. Not much, but measurably. Since the last official documentation 5 years ago, each totem had rotated clockwise, 15 to 20 degrees. All 4 of them, in the same direction. I made careful notes, took additional photos, documented everything. But I didn't approach the observation points. Protocol CS4 was clear. 10 meters minimum. No touching the poles. I wanted to examine the bases, see if there was evidence of shifting or erosion. But the rules were non-negotiable. I spent 3 hours at the site, completed my documentation. Then I packed up and headed back to the station. The whole walk back, I couldn't stop thinking about those rotations. 15 to 20 degrees. All clockwise. All 4 poles. In 5 years, there had to be an explanation. Ground settling. Erosion. Freeze-thaw cycles. Something geological. Something that didn't involve the totems moving on their own. Because totems didn't move. They were carved wood. Inanimate objects. Historical artifacts. That's what I told myself all the way back to the station. That's what I wrote in my initial report that evening. Minor positional changes noted. Recommend geological survey to assess ground stability. Professional language. Rational explanation. Nothing that would make me sound paranoid or superstitious. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Protocol CS1. Never approach the totem sites during fog conditions. If fog develops while you are at a site, immediately return to the station by the most direct route. Do not run. Do not look back at the totems. Why would the protocol specifically say not to look back? Why the instruction not to run? What would happen if I did? At 2 a.m. I gave up on sleep. Métis. Sat at the desk reading the protocol binder again. Looking for explanations. Looking for context. But the protocols were just rules. No justification. No explanation. Just instructions. Then I found something I'd missed the first time. A loose page tucked into the back of the binder. Handwritten. Dated 3 years ago. The note said, Day 47. The totems in the eastern site have moved again. Confirmed with measurements. 22 degrees since last month. Sarah thinks I'm losing it. Maybe I am. But the numbers don't lie. They're rotating. Always clockwise. Always when the fog comes in. I started documenting the fog patterns, trying to correlate movement with weather. But Sarah says I'm obsessing, says I need to focus on the actual preservation work. Maybe she's right. Maybe I'm seeing patterns that aren't there. But I swear they move faster when I'm watching them. Like they know I'm documenting them. Like they don't want to be observed. The note wasn't signed, but it was dated March 15th, 3 years ago. Right in the middle of what should have been someone's posting. I checked the personnel records in the station files. March 3 years ago, there had been 2 officers assigned. The only time the island had ever been double-staffed. Their names were David Chan and Sarah Blackwood. Both had requested emergency evacuation in April. Less than a month after that note was written, medical records were sealed. But the note in the protocol binder had mentioned psychological distress. 2 officers who violated protocols. required evacuation and medical intervention. David and Sarah, they'd been watching the totems, documenting movement, breaking Protocol CS4 by going beyond standard documentation, getting obsessed. And something had happened. Something bad enough that they both left early. Bad enough that Parks Canada added that handwritten warning to the protocol binder. I put David's note back where I'd found it, closed the binder, sat in the dark thinking about what I'd seen today. The 15 to 20 degree rotation. The fact that it matched what David had observed. The fact that the totems were still moving, still rotating, still doing something that carved wood shouldn't be able to do. And tomorrow I have 3 more sites to document, 14 more totems to photograph and measure, 14 more chances to notice things that didn't make sense, 14 more opportunities to become like David, obsessed, breaking protocols, seeing patterns that maybe weren't there, or maybe were. But I wouldn't obsess. I'd follow the protocols, do my job, document what I saw without trying to explain it. That's what the rules were for. To keep me from thinking too hard about things I didn't understand. Things that could drive someone to request emergency evacuation. Things that waited in the fog. Because in the morning I'd visit the eastern site. The one David had mentioned in his note. The one where the totems moved fastest. The one where he'd started to lose it. And I'd see for myself if the patterns were real. If the totems really moved when the fog rolled in. If the protocols were protecting me from something I couldn't yet see but would soon understand. The next 3 days I documented the remaining sites. The eastern cluster had 5 totems. The southern site had 6. The western site had 3. Each location is the same as the northern cluster. Weathered cedar poles, faded paint, carved figures watching the forest. And every single one had rotated since the last official documentation. The eastern site was the worst, 28 degrees. Some poles had turned almost 30 degrees in 5 years. I triple-checked my measurements, used 3 different methods to confirm. GPS coordinates, compass bearings, triangulation from fixed landmarks. The data was consistent. The totems were moving, rotating clockwise. All of them, across all 4 sites. On my 4th night, I radioed in my weekly check-in. The dispatcher on the mainland was a woman named Rita. She'd worked Parks Canada Communications for 20 years. She asked about my health, about the equipment, about the weather, standard check-in questions. Then she asked about my work. Documentation is going well, I said. I've completed all 4 sites, taking measurements and photos. But I've noticed something unusual. There was a pause on the radio. Then Rita's voice came back more serious. What kind of unusual? Positional changes. All the totems have rotated clockwise since the last survey. 15 to 30 degrees. I think we need a geological assessment. The ground might be unstable. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Rita said, Sienna, I need you to listen carefully. What you've noticed is documented. It's expected. Don't spend time trying to explain it. Just record the measurements and move on to the preservation work. My stomach went cold. It's expected? The totems are moving and that's expected. Yes. It's part of the site's documented behavior. There's nothing you can do about it. Nothing that needs investigation. Your job is to monitor and document, not to explain. Do you understand? But, Sienna. Rita's voice was firm now. Read Protocol C7. Then call me back if you have questions. But I think you'll understand why we don't investigate this particular phenomenon. She signed off. I sat there holding the radio, feeling sick. I grabbed the protocol binder, flipped to Protocol CS7. It was on page 19. I'd skimmed it before but hadn't really absorbed it. Protocol CS7. Do not attempt to explain or investigate the positional changes in the totem poles. This phenomenon has been documented since 1973 and is considered a natural characteristic of the site. Attempting to understand the mechanism behind the movement has led to psychological distress in previous station officers. Your role is to document changes, not to explain them. Accept the movement as an observable fact and do not develop theories about causation. Below that, in the same handwriting as the other notes. The more you try to understand why they move, the more you'll notice other things. Things that will make you question your sanity. Don't start down that path. Just do your job and ignore the rest. Trust me. I called Rita back. I read it. Good. Now listen. You're going to notice other things too. Sounds, patterns, coincidences. Your brain will try to make connections. Try to explain what's happening. Don't let it. Follow the protocols. Document what you're required to document. Ignore everything else. The previous officers who had problems, they couldn't let it go. They became obsessed with understanding, and that obsession destroyed them. What did they see? It doesn't matter what they saw. It matters that they looked too closely, paid too much attention, violated protocols that were designed to protect them. Don't be like them. You have 3 years there. You can complete this posting successfully if you stop trying to understand and just follow the rules. We talked for another 10 minutes. Rita explained that every officer who'd worked the island had noticed the movement. It was unavoidable, but most officers accepted it as a quirk of the site and moved on. The ones who couldn't accept it, who needed to explain it, who started documenting patterns and developing theories, those were the ones who broke, who requested evacuation, who ended up in psychiatric care. After the call, I sat at the desk looking at my documentation. 5 days of careful measurements, photographs, GPS data. Everything proved the totems were rotating, moving clockwise, 15 to 30 degrees over 5 years. And I had to just accept it. Don't question it. Not investigate. Just record the numbers and move on to other work. But Rita had said I'd notice other things too. What other things? What else was happening on this island that the protocols were protecting me from? What had David and Sarah seen that broke them? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning I woke to thick fog. It had rolled in overnight. Dense white blanket that reduced visibility to maybe 10 meters. The solar panels were barely generating power. The forest was invisible. The research station felt like it was floating in a void of white. I checked the protocols. Protocol CS1 was clear. Never approach totem sites during fog. And I wasn't planning to. But then I heard it. Distant. Rhythmic. Coming from the north where the first site was located. Drumming. Slow. Steady. For beats. Pause. For beats. Pause. Over and over. Not loud, but clear. Carrying through the fog like it was right outside even though I knew the northern site was 2 kilometers away. Protocol CS3. If you hear drumming sounds coming from the forest, return to the station immediately. Lock all doors and windows. Do not investigate the source of the sounds. I was already in the station, but I hadn't locked the doors and windows. I did that now. Checked every lock. Closed the shutters. Then I sat at the desk, listening to the drumming, trying not to think about what was making that sound, trying not to wonder if the totems moved faster during fog, if that's when the rotation happened, if the drumming was connected somehow. The fog lasted all day. The drumming continued until sunset. Then it stopped. Abruptly, like someone had ended a ceremony. The fog began to clear around 9 p.m. By midnight, the stars were visible again. The next morning, I hiked back to the northern site. Not to document, just to check, just to see if anything had changed. I stayed at the observation points, took quick photos, compared them to yesterday's documentation. The totems had moved, all 4 of them, another 5 degrees. In one night, during the fog, while the drumming played, they'd rotated more in 12 hours than they usually did in months. I documented it, took measurements, entered the data, but I didn't report it to Rita, didn't tell anyone what I'd discovered, because Protocol CS7 was clear. Don't investigate. Don't try to explain. Just accept it. But accepting it was becoming impossible. Because now I know. The fog made them move. The drumming accompanied the movement. And the protocols keeping me away from the sites during fog weren't just about safety. They were about not witnessing something, not seeing the totems in motion, not understanding how inanimate wood could rotate on its own. And that's when I realized what the real danger was. Not the totems themselves, but knowing too much about them, seeing too much, understanding too much. That's what broke the previous officers. Not the phenomenon, but the certainty that what they were witnessing was impossible. That's what drove them to psychiatric evaluation. The cognitive dissonance between what they saw and what could possibly be real. The protocols weren't protecting me from the totems. They were protecting me from knowledge, from understanding, from seeing things that would make me question everything I thought I knew about reality. But it was too late for me. I'd already seen too much. I'd already started making connections. And over the next few weeks, I'd see even more. Things that would make the rotating totems seem almost normal. Things that would test my sanity more than any carved would ever could. Because on Kitimat Island, the totems weren't the real mystery. They were just the most visible sign of something much larger. Something that happened in the fog. Something that the drumming called or accompanied or celebrated. Something that the Tsimshian people had known about, had carved into wood and left behind, had abandoned this island to get away from. And I was about to learn what that something was, whether I wanted to or not. Over the next month, I developed a routine. Document the totems weekly. Measure. Photograph. Record the slow clockwise rotation. And every time the fog rolled in, I stayed in the station. Locked the doors. Listened to the drumming. I tried not to think about what was happening out there in the white. But the fog came more frequently. Once a week at first. Then twice. Then 3 times. By my 8th week on the island, fog was rolling in every other day. Dense. Impenetrable. Always accompanied by the drumming. Always followed by measurable rotation in the totems. I started keeping a log that wasn't part of my official documentation. Private notes. Correlating fog patterns with rotation rates. The relationship was clear. More fog meant more movement. The totems rotated fastest during fog that lasted longer than 6 hours. And the drumming always played during those long fog events. For beats. Pause. For beats. Never varying. I knew I was violating Protocol CS7. I knew I was doing exactly what David had done. Obsessing. Looking for patterns. Trying to explain. But I couldn't stop. The data was too compelling. The correlation is too obvious. Something was making the totems move during the fog. And the drumming was part of it. Then I started noticing other things. Footprints near the research station after foggy nights. Barefoot prints. Human-sized. But the toes were wrong. Too long. Too many joints. The prints appeared in patterns. Circles around the station. Always clockwise. Like something had been walking around the building while I was locked inside. I photographed the prints. Measured them. But I didn't report them. What would I say? That something with wrong feet was circling the station during fog? That would sound insane. That would get me evacuated like David and Sarah. The prints appeared more frequently. Sometimes I'd find them leading to the totem sites, following my trail from the day before. Like something was retracing my steps, visiting the same observation points, standing where I'd stood. I stopped sleeping well, started having dreams about the totems, dreams where I was standing in the clearing and the poles were rotating, slowly at first, then faster, spinning like carousel horses, the carved figures eagle, raven, bear, thunderbird all watching me as they spun. And in the dreams I knew I wasn't supposed to be there, knew I'd violated some protocol, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop watching. I'd wake up gasping, heart pounding, and sometimes I'd hear the drumming, faint, distant, even though there was no fog, even though it should be silent. By week 12, I was seeing things during the day too. Movement at the edge of my vision, shadows in the forest that didn't match the trees. Once I saw a figure standing at the northern site, tall, too tall, wearing something dark. But when I looked directly at it, nothing was there. Just the 4 totems. Still. Silent. Watching. I called Rita for my check-in. I tried to sound normal, professional, but she knew. How are you really doing, Sienna? I'm fine. Work is going well. Documentation is on schedule. Are you sleeping? Enough. Are you following the protocols? I hesitated. Yes. All of them? Including CS7? The silence stretched. Finally I said, I'm noticing patterns. I can't help it. The fog, the drumming, the movement, it's all connected. Rita's voice became very serious. Sienna, I need you to stop. Right now. Stop looking for patterns. Stop trying to connect things. You're on the same path David took. It doesn't end well. But it's real. The totems move during fog. The drumming coincides with the rotation. There are footprints. Stop. Rita's voice was sharp. Don't tell me about footprints. Don't tell me what you think you're seeing. I'm scheduling an early supply drop. Next week. I'm sending someone to check on you. I don't need checking on. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're displaying the same patterns as previous officers. Obsession, pattern seeking, paranoia. If this continues, I'll have to evacuate you, and your career will be over. Is that what you want? No, it wasn't what I wanted, but I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. Couldn't know what I knew. The totems moved. Something walked around my station at night. The drumming was real. The fog was connected. These weren't delusions. These were documented facts. But Rita was right about one thing. I was becoming obsessed. I was doing exactly what the protocols warned against. And if I continued, I'd break. Just like David and Sarah. Just like many others before them. I had to choose. Keep investigating and lose my career, maybe my sanity. Or accept the mystery. Follow the protocols. Ignore what I couldn't explain. Live with the not knowing. That night, the fog rolled in again. Thick. Oppressive. The drumming started at sunset. For beats. Pause. For beats. I sat at the desk, not looking at my private log. Not adding new data. Not documenting the patterns I knew were happening outside. But I couldn't help listening. Couldn't help counting the beats. Couldn't help noticing that the drumming was closer tonight. Louder. Like it was coming from right outside the research station instead of from the totem sites. At midnight, I made a decision I knew violated every protocol. A decision that would either prove I was right or prove I was losing my mind. I unlocked the door, stepped outside into the fog, and I started walking north. Toward the drumming, toward the site where I knew the totems were rotating. toward whatever was making the sound. The fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face, but I knew the trail. I'd walked it dozens of times. I moved slowly, carefully, following the path by memory, following the drumming, getting closer. And then I saw them, shapes in the fog, tall, moving, dancing, 7 figures. No 8, no more. Human shape but wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving in a circle around the 4 totems, moving clockwise, their feet hitting the ground in rhythm with the drums. For beats. Step, 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 step. Pause. For beats. The totems were rotating. I could see it happening. Slow, smooth, like they were mounted on turntables. The carved figures turned to follow the dancers. Eagle watching raven, raven watching bear, bear watching thunderbird, thunderbird watching eagle. An endless cycle. A ceremony I'd interrupted by being here. One of the figures stopped dancing, turned toward me. It was wearing a mask, cedar bark, painted, the face of raven, black, watchful. And behind the mask I knew there were eyes, looking at me, seeing that I'd violated the protocols, that I'd come to the site during fog, that I'd witnessed what I wasn't supposed to witness. The drumming stopped. All the figures stopped moving, turned toward me, all wearing masks. Eagle, raven, bear, thunderbird. More than I didn't recognize. Creatures from stories I'd never learned, from traditions that weren't mine to know. And I understood. This was a sacred ceremony, still happening, still being performed. Whatever had been left on this island when the Tsimshian people left, by whatever they'd carved into the totems and then abandoned, by whatever continued the old ways in the fog where humans couldn't see. I'd violated something profound. Interrupted something that had been kept private for over a century, seen something that the protocols had specifically warned me not to see. I backed away, slowly, like Protocol CS1 instructed. Normal walking pace. Don't run. Don't look back. But I couldn't help it. I looked back. The figures were following me, not chasing, just walking, keeping pace. Maintaining the same distance. Their masks pointed at me, watching, making sure I left, making sure I returned to where I belonged. I made it back to the station, locked the door, closed the shutters, sat in the dark listening to my heart pound. The drumming started again outside, closer now, right outside the walls, circling, clockwise. The same circle the footprints made. The same circle the dancers performed around the totems. It continued all night. By dawn the fog was clearing. The drumming faded, stopped. When I finally opened the door, there were footprints everywhere. Hundreds of them, circling the station. All barefoot, all with those wrong toes. All confirming that what I'd seen wasn't a delusion. It wasn't an obsession. It was real. But I couldn't report it, couldn't document it, because doing so would mean admitting I'd violated Protocol CS1, would mean explaining that I'd gone to the totem site during fog, would mean revealing that I'd seen the ceremony, and that would end my career, would get me evacuated, would prove I'd failed. So I said nothing. When the supply helicopter came 3 days later with a supervisor to check on me, I acted normal, professional, showed her my documentation work, my photographs and measurements, the rotating totems. She examined everything, asked about my sleep, my mental state, my adherence to protocols. I lied, said I was fine, said I was following all protocols, said the isolation was manageable, and she believed me, or pretended to believe me, or knew I was lying but didn't care as long as I could maintain the pretense. She left. I stayed, and I made a decision. I would complete my 3 years. I would continue my documentation, but I would never again violate the protocols, never again try to see the ceremony, never again interrupt what happened in the fog, because I finally understood what the protocols were really protecting. Not me, but them, the dancers, the ceremony, the tradition that continued long after the people who'd created it were gone. The totems weren't the artifacts. The ceremony was. And my job wasn't to document it. My job was to leave it alone. The totems continued to rotate. The fog continued to roll in. The drumming continued to play. But I stayed in the station when it happened. Followed Protocol CS1. Didn't look. Didn't listen too closely. Didn't try to understand. And slowly over months the obsession faded. The dreams stopped. The shadows at the edge of my vision disappeared. I learned to document the rotation without wondering why. To hear the drumming without trying to identify the instruments. To see the footprints without measuring them. I learned to live with the mystery. To accept that some things weren't meant to be explained. That some knowledge wasn't meant for me. That some ceremonies continued with or without human witnesses, and that the protocols existed not to hide the truth, but to protect something sacred from being reduced to data. 3 years. I completed my full posting, documented 18 totems, recorded their slow clockwise rotation, measured, photographed, filed reports, and never once mentioned the dancers, the ceremony, the masks, what I'd seen that night in the fog. When I left the island, I handed my successor the protocol binder, showed her the notes from previous officers, warned her about obsession, about pattern seeking, about the danger of knowing too much. She listened, nodded, signed the acknowledgement form, and I saw in her eyes the same confidence I'd had. The same certainty that she could follow the rules. The same belief that she was different from the officers who'd broken. I didn't try to convince her otherwise. She'd learn. They all learned. Either they'd follow the protocols and complete their posting, or they'd investigate and leave early. Or like me, they'd violate the rules once, understand what they'd interrupted, and spend the rest of their time trying to forget. But I never forgot. Years later, I still dream about it sometimes. The figures in the fog, the rotating totems, the ceremony I wasn't meant to see. And I wake up grateful that I learned to look away. Grateful that the protocols saved me. Grateful that I left the dancers alone. Because on Kitimat Island, the totems move when the fog rolls in. That's a documented fact. But why they move and who moves them and what the movement means, those are questions I learned not to ask. Questions that have no answers I'm meant to know. Questions that the protocols wisely tell you to ignore. And if you ever find yourself on a remote island, following rules that don't make sense, confronting mysteries you can't explain, follow the protocols. Don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Some things are sacred. Some ceremonies continue, and some knowledge comes at a price too high to pay. The totems still rotate, the fog still rolls in, the drumming still plays, and somewhere on Kitimat Island, a new officer is learning what I learned, deciding whether to follow the protocols or break them, choosing between knowledge and sanity. I hope she chooses wisely. I hope she learns to look away. Because the price of seeing it is higher than you think. And once you've witnessed what moves in the fog, you can never again pretend the world works the way you thought it did.